Grab your pitchforks and rotten fruit. You're entering the show that encourages dangerous discussions with God's holy book. I'm your host, Ryan White, and this is Conversations with the Bible. Welcome, everyone, to another Conversation with the Bible. This show was actually inspired by a question that was posted that I thought was pretty good. Not a lot of you probably have struggled with the concept of documentary hypothesis or the JDEP theory, but I know some people do, and so I wanted to bring on a guest on the show and discuss exactly what this theory is, what parts of it we can kind of learn from, and ultimately how we reject this because it's not that great. Shalom, everyone. Welcome to another Conversations with the Bible. This week we are discussing a kind of controversial topic, I would say. This was actually based on a question that was posed online. I had put out a filler if anyone wanted to pose some questions that we could answer on the show. And one of the questions was asking about what's called the JDEP hypothesis. It's also known as documentary hypothesis. And they asked, do I subscribe to this? And discussing the authorship of the Torah. So I figured what we could do is actually expand this out, not just to the Torah itself, but kind of talk about the overall structure of the Bible. Where does it come from? Can we trust our Bible? The sources, how it's actually written down. And it just turns out that one of my good friends is also, he actually has just finished up his requirements for his master's in biblical studies, I believe it is. His name is Matt Nappier. Hi, Matt.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And so your degree is in biblical studies, correct?
Well, my degree is actually in Old Testament studies.
Old Testament studies, okay. So it's probably...
Yeah, Master of Arts in Old Testament with a minor in New Testament, so...
Okay, so it's probably pretty similar to what my master's is. Mine was master's in biblical study with Old Testament specialization, which probably is about the same as yours. I had a little bit of New Testament stuff, but it was mainly Old Testament focused.
That's right. Sounds like just they worded it different, but yep.
Yeah. And then you're actually going on to become a doctor. You don't want to be a master anymore. You just want to be the doctor. Trying to pass me up.
Well, no doubt. I told Tyler on Facebook the other day I can get about 2 years into my doctorate program, and Ryan will catch me if he decides to come back to school. So
that's kind of depending on if my wife and if I want to stay married. I think she she was very supportive of me going through this schooling, but it definitely takes a toll on you when you're especially taking 3 or 4 classes in a semester, plus working a full-time job and everything else. So,
absolutely, I can. I think I can speak for both of us when we say that our wives have sacrificed a lot for us to be able to do what, for me anyway, is I feel God has led me to continue education in this manner, and I'm excited about where it's going. But our wives have definitely made a huge sacrifice. Late nights of me staying up, reading, studying, researching, writing papers, her handling kids by herself at times. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, before we get going, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about kind of your role in ministry, and if people want to connect with you, how they could do that?
Oh, sure. So, my name is Matt Nappier. I was born and raised in West Monroe, Louisiana. You might recognize the town as a little-known town of bearded men called the Duck Dynasty. That's my hometown. It's where I live now. On the professional side right now, I am active duty for the military, and I work in recruiting and retention. And so I do that full-time. That's my full-time position. And then outside of that, we live on a 60-acre working farm where we produce mostly dairy products but we also have, egg-laying chickens, and we produce meat chickens periodically throughout the year and a little bit of produce. So that's kind of what I'm at. I've been in the military for 17 years now. So I'm kind of on the downhill slope, and hopefully, I'll finish up school by the time I retire, and I can roll right into teaching at the collegiate level. But nice. Ministry-wise, I guess co-pastor, if you could say. I'm one of the pastors of Beit Shalom Messianic Congregation in Monroe, Louisiana. You can link up with us on BeitShalomMonroe.com. That's BeitShalomMonroe.com, BeitShalomMonroe.com. We're on Facebook as well. I don't have really a personal ministry per se for me or anything like that. If you want to connect with me, just look me up, Matt Nappier. Last name is Nappier. Look me up on Facebook. Most of my efforts go towards my local congregation as of now, but I'm definitely, I connect. I go around. I speak every once in a while at different congregations that, I love to network and really just connect the community and the body of Messiah. So.
Amen. Well, thank you for your service. It's always good to have U.S. military on the show, since you're the first one outside of my little stint in the Navy.
That's right. I was going to say fellow military.
Fellow military, yeah. Yeah, I didn't quite make it to the 17-year point, but that's okay. I'm doing something much more fun now, which is, cleaning up people after they soil themselves in bed.
I'll leave that to you. I don't want to be part of that.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the... First, I guess we can start off with this, what's called you might hear it as the JDEP hypothesis, or documentary hypothesis is its actual name. And if I remember right, you said you were just actually going over this in a class. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my first PhD class that I'm taking is research methods of, it's a long title, I can't remember right now, research methods of Old Testament, something along those lines. But it's basically a critical introduction on a PhD level. It was something that I'm sure you took. I had to take a critical introduction class for the master's degree, and this is just kind of taking it a step further. So
yeah. So why don't you run us through really quick just kind of what the hypothesis is, the documentary hypothesis? Yeah,
so I guess I could, if you don't mind, I would give like a little bit of history as well.
Sure.
Documentary hypothesis is really attributed to one man, Julius Wellhausen from Germany, but it didn't really start with him. It started with a host of people, 4, 5, 6 people before him, and he was in the 19th century, 1800s. Mm-hmm. But really, you can trace it back to like the 17th century with John Ostrich, and he started the theory, not knowing where it would end up, but he just basically looked at the scriptures, the Old Testament, and namely the Torah, and he said, where can I see the text that express God by his formal name, Yod He Vav He, and where do I see him expressed as Elohim? And he started just recording these differences in the name. And so, he would take all the scriptures with the proper name, and then all the scriptures with the pronoun, or Elohim, the title Elohim, and he would make a list of all the text. And he was just exploring. It's interesting. At first, I think he was just really exploring. It's interesting that these things are this way. Why did the writer change how he expressed God with his name or his address? But it would evolve, and I use that word on purpose. It would evolve up until the 19th century, where Wellhausen, who had little interest in the Bible growing up necessarily, he all of a sudden had interest in the Bible when someone told him that the Torah probably was written after the prophets, and all of a sudden he perked up, and we could talk about that later. I think there's a reason why he perked up, but through his studies he would come to label different parts of the text into 4 categories, the JEDP. Mm-hmm. Documentary is the D, not documentary. Deuteronomic is the D, which really is relegated just to the book of Deuteronomy. It's very little text outside of that. J, which would be all the texts that have to do with the name where it's expressed, Yod He Vav He. E would be the Elohim text, and then P would be the priestly text, what we would know as like ritualistic text, the Leviticus, the priestly ordinances and stuff like that. And so he would separate them into those things, and that's basically the documentary hypothesis, is that not just the Torah now, the entire Bible, because there's another phrase for when you get into the New Testament where they do the same exact thing, and they try to say that the New Testament itself was chopped up and distributed, and just
the Q source and stuff like that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, Q source and different things like that. But and to wrap up the documentary hypothesis intro, I guess what they suggest is really that there were redactors, people that put the text together, and they didn't just put the text together. They didn't say Genesis was written by one person, Leviticus by another. Mm-hmm. They literally have places where an individual verse they will attribute to 3 different authors. Yeah. And they would suggest that the redactors basically took scissors and cut these pieces up and like a child would, or cut the words out and rearranged them and put them together into the text we have today. Something that's not seen anywhere in history, and we have no proof of with the Bible. But that's you can add to that. That's kind of my intro.
Yeah, I was going to say, from what I remember, now it's been a while since I took a class in this, even though, honestly, a lot of times this sort of stuff does pop up, periodically. But I do remember my professor talking about that this actually did even, really originate with Christian scholars, that medieval rabbis and possibly even before that, not necessarily the JDEP, but they recognized that there could possibly be different authors in the Torah itself. And I don't know which rabbinic text, or commentaries discuss that, but I know that he did mention there were some rabbinic commentaries, back in medieval times that were mentioning this.
Yeah, absolutely. That is true.
The other thing that my professor pointed out that I think is important to bring up is that there is no consensus on which texts are attributed to whom. Different scholars will attribute, this passage or this verse or this part of a verse to the Deuteronomist, whereas another one might, ascribe it to the priestly source. And so it's not like you could actually go out and buy a list of every single verse that is supposedly written by each of these different theorists.
That's right. And I was reading a book for class. This book is called Methods for Exodus, and it's not to push this theory. It's an overview of different critical theories. The Deuteronomy, the documentary hypothesis is just, it's considered source criticism and redaction criticism. It's just one type of criticism when looking at the biblical text. But so it's just an overview, and now I segued off into what I was reading, and I forgot what did you just say? I'm sorry.
I was talking about how each scholar kind of makes up their own.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they make up their own. And so I was pointing out in this book here, there's a scholar by the name of Suzanne Boorer, Boorer, and she's pro documentary hypothesis, and you'll see a lot of scholars do this when they go through, and she's going to talk about Exodus 1 and 2, which is a favorite text for documentary hypothesis scholars. She's going to talk about Exodus 1 and 2, and she's going to label all of the priestly portions of the text. And what she does with the rest, she labels it non-priestly. Of course, that leaves it open, so she's not boxing herself into a corner or making it look like, she disagrees on other people and different things. Yeah. She leaves it open. It's just non-priestly. These are the priestly, but this is non-priestly. But there's, like you said, there's no standard to go by, nor do we see a standard in history. We have no record historical of anyone being attributed to piecing this together in this way.
Yeah. Now, so with this theory, I want to just kind of talk about some of the pros to the theory, some of the things that kind of would stand out and be possible evidence of some sort of either different authors or at least kind of piecing it together. Actually, before we do that, let's kind of talk a little bit about how documents actually ended up coming to be.
Right.
And I think one of the biggest places to start with to talk about would be actually the Gospels. The Gospels, there was no one following Yeshua around as a stenographer writing down what he was doing. The Jewish people were very oral culture at this point in time, and even with the written text, for the most part, you really only have about 10% of the population who is literate enough to actually read a full scroll, right? I mean, most people were able to kind of do little short sentences here and there, but a full scroll, you got to realize there's no spacing between the letters. There's no nakud, vowel points. It's all just like one long continuous thing, and so very few people are actually able to sit down and read it. And on top of that, there's hardly any scrolls out there to begin with. One synagogue would be fortunate to have every single scroll in it.
Absolutely.
So most people actually don't read the text, they hear the text. This is why, Yeshua talks about blessed are those who hear and obey and stuff like that, because that's how you studied the Bible, was by hearing it, not so much reading it. And so when we look at these gospel stories, the gospels actually don't get written down until around the time that the first generation is dying out. Once you kind of lose that original witness, most likely, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are people who are traveling around teaching this gospel orally, and it's only when they're getting near the end of their life that this is actually going to get written down.
Yep. If I could maybe add to that, I spent the majority of my time in my master's degree anyway, focusing on the prophets of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And as much as I love the Torah, I had spent 10 to 12 years of my life studying Torah before I went to school, and so I kind of wanted to explore other books that I hadn't spent much time on. So I spent a large majority of my time on the prophets, and I went into it thinking, that these books were written down as prophecy, as if Jeremiah wrote Jeremiah and handed it out to everyone and said, okay, now read my prophecy. But the prophets were the same way. Nobody was following the prophet around, copying what he was saying, and the prophet wasn't writing it down and handing it out or sending it out in the email. The prophet was, just as God told him, speaking these things to the children of Israel, the children of Judah, and the same thing with Moses. Moses is always told, speak unto the children of Israel, not write down. I mean, there's times where he's told to write down things, but the spoken word was so much important than the written word, and the written word only came about to relay what the speaker could no longer speak to the audience, namely us today. So. Yeah,
and I was going to say, Deuteronomy 1 verse 1, these are the words that Moses spoke to all the children, or to all of Israel, right? It's not, these are the words that Moses wrote down. These are the words that Moses spoke.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up.
So, and if Moses is writing this down, that's a little awkward. He's speaking about himself in kind of the third or second person, whatever that would be. I guess the second person, or third person. That's right. It's a little bit awkward there. And here's the thing: is that nowhere does it actually say that Moses is writing this. Most documents that we have, or most books of the Bible, really don't tell us who wrote them.
Right.
To my knowledge, you're only looking at the letters of Paul and Peter and so on, the letters of the apostles that really, actually talk about authorship. I guess Luke and Acts also as well. Well, I guess let's talk a little bit about Deuteronomy then, because this is kind of a good place to talk about where we might see at least evidence of that the book, let's say the book of Deuteronomy may have been written down at a later date. There was a couple verses I wanted to bring up here.
Yep.
First off, Deuteronomy 29, verse 20, I guess we'll start in verse 27, says, "Therefore the anger of the Lord burned against the land, to bring upon it every curse which is written in the book." This is right after the the curses. If you do this stuff, you're going to be cursed and you're going to be sent into exile. And it says in verse 28, "The Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and in fury and in great wrath, and cast them into another land, as it is this day." Now that last little blurb there kind of doesn't make any sense unless this is being at least edited sometime after they're sent into exile, right? Because he's talking about the curses of Deuteronomy and being sent into exile, and that little statement, "as it is this day," implies that they are cast into another land when at least this part of this is being written down. And as I think you had mentioned earlier, the role of a redactor would be to take a text and translate it in one sense, just like no one reads the original 1611 King James English. Our King James Bible today has been updated, and so this would be something that happened in Israel. In any language, you got to update the language. So it could be that this is added in, or as some scholars would say, this would be evidence that this section was written well later on.
Yeah.
We also see this.
Go
ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. So it's texts like these that would lead. And to be fair, I want to be fair up front. I should have said this up front because this isn't really up front. We're kind of halfway into it. But to be fair, we want to be honest when we're talking about scholarship and people who have different ideas than ours. And we want to be fair and say these people aren't necessarily making this up out of nowhere. I do personally believe that they have motivations that lead them to their conclusions. Mm-hmm. But they do see text like this, and it draws a question. So how are we going to answer the question, and how did they answer the question, and can we understand where they're coming from? So,
yeah,
I do want to say that, but
yeah, and I would agree with you. So, some of them, I think, like Wellhausen, kind of had some ulterior motives and kind of trying to denigrate Scripture a little bit. But there are a lot of people who have seen the evidence and they take the Bible very seriously, but they do come away with the conclusion that it was written later on. And to be honest with you, even if it's written later on, that doesn't take away from what the text is telling us. It just
That's
means.
Right.
Go ahead.
It's still telling the history and the story of Israel. It's still telling the truth of what God has done.
Yes, and that's actually another aspect of it, and that's why I mentioned the oral tradition of passing things down orally. So let's say that tomorrow they uncover absolute evidence that the book of Deuteronomy was written in exile. Does that destroy our trust in the Bible? And I would answer that no, because they pass down stories. This is how cultures have done this for thousands of years. And so even if they prove beyond a shadow of doubt, which I don't think is possible, but even if they did prove beyond a shadow of doubt this was written in Babylon, that doesn't mean that the story wasn't passed down orally. And by the time it's written down, now there is possibly these little additions, like "as it is this day." You can also look in Deuteronomy 34, where it says that Moses died and was buried. I'm looking for the exact verse here. And verse 34, verse 6, it says, "He was buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day." Another one of those statements is kind of like, did they all just have amnesia right after writing this text? Did they just forget? And then just a couple of verses later, verse 10, it talks about Joshua the son of Nun was raised up, and it says, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses since then, right? And if this is being written by Moses himself before he dies, or by Joshua, the impact of that statement really is very weak. Like, 10 days after he dies, there hasn't arisen a prophet since then. Well, it's only been 10 days, guys. Maybe we should wait a little bit longer. But a statement like this, 100 years later or 500 years later, does have a pretty strong impact. And so to kind of answer the question that was asked, what are my thoughts on this? I don't think that there's strong enough evidence that we can honestly say that there were clearly 4 different authors. But we do see evidence that at least someone, after the text is either written or transmitted orally, updated the text and inserted kind of their own commentary. That like the being cast into another land as it is this day. Now, this is just a little blurb, but more than likely this is some sort of commentary on what was either passed down through written text or passed down orally. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that from my study, I haven't seen where a vast overhaul of the text was done by people, throughout the centuries. And what we were talking about at the beginning, a vast overhaul, people snipping different texts and placing them together, and these stories being completely fabricated, and there is no hand of God in it. But was there, when we understand the way the text has been delivered to us today, and we understand that when copyists, what we call scribes or copyists, when they copy these things, at times they did add their own comments. A footnote, because I want to point out, like you said earlier, there was no punctuation in Hebrew, and if we get into the New Testament, Greek, there's no punctuation, there's no breaks in sentences. Later on, they would add different styles and stuff. But if you have a line that's going across a page with no punctuation and no breaks in sentences, and then all of a sudden you have a commentator's note out to the side, and like you said, we're going to get to an age where, no, I don't think you brought this up, but there were different ways of copying text. I can copy the text from myself, look at a piece of paper, then look at my paper and copy what the other piece of paper says. But I can also have someone who is reading the text to me and to 5 other scribes or copyists. And so if that person reading the text all of a sudden reads a comment or something like, it's just one idea of how these comments get into these texts. Did the commentator or the copyist mean to add the addition or not? I mean, these are things we could never possibly answer.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that it's not the Word of God, and it doesn't mean that it still doesn't hold the truth that God intended to share with us.
Absolutely, yeah.
I would add one more example, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
A different kind of example of where they would get the idea that these texts were kind of copied and pasted. And this is kind of in a bigger sense, instead of one single phrase or half a verse. If we look at Genesis, and this is a source of a lot of this theory. If we look at Genesis and we see Genesis 37, we have the story of Joseph. And Genesis 39, we have the story of Joseph continues. But Genesis 38 tells the story of Judah. And so they would look at this text and they would say, this story is completely out of place. Somebody added this story in the middle of the story of Joseph. So that's kind of how they come away with some of these ideas that it was piecemealed together.
Yeah, and this is actually kind of one of the areas that we talked about in my classes was these claims that it was piecemealed together. First off, how do we know that it wasn't piecemealed together? These stories, who was originally writing this down, whether it's Moses or whether it was someone before Moses or someone after Moses, how do we know that they didn't intentionally put that insertion in there? There was a really great book I read I believe it was. I'll have to look for the name of the book. It was some by someone named Ardell was, I think, the last name. But she,
I don't know that one.
it was called. I'll look this up while I'm talking. Anyways, she talks about how a lot of this stuff that people take as showing signs of different authorships are actually just literary styles, right?
Absolutely.
It's an intentional way of, here it is, poetics and interpretation of biblical narrative by Adele Berlin. This was a book. If anyone out there is struggling with, documentary hypothesis and kind of, really has been looking into it and has issues with some of these things, this book is really good because she just kind of goes through just the way that people write. They use different words and they use different ways of saying things as a literary method. And this is where a lot of this documentary hypothesis has gone completely overboard, is that they negate the literary the shifting in the narrative as a literary technique to pull something out, right?
Absolutely.
This insertion here, if we want to call it, of Judah and Tamar, I would say actually makes sense because it kind of tells the story of, the Genesis 37 talks about Joseph's brothers, and it is Judah, in fact, who tries to make money off of selling Joseph, right? Instead of killing him, he's like, let's make some profit off of this. I want to make some money. And then Genesis 38, if you actually study this out from the cultural perspective, why does Judah not want to give his next son? And what's the issue with not giving his next son to Tamar? Well, it has all to do with the inheritance and money there.
Money, exactly.
So when you look at it from that perspective,
I agree 100%. Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing with the book of John. Is it John chapter 8, where the earliest manuscripts don't have the adulterous woman?
Chapter 8. Yeah.
And that's a great example. We know for a fact that the earliest manuscripts do not have the story of the adulterous woman in there. So some people say, oh well, it's a made up story, and it was. And they assign all this meaning to it. But if you actually look at what's going on there, in John chapter 7, it is the feast of Sukkot, right? It's the last great day of Sukkot. And what do people do at Sukkot? They all come and they camp out around Jerusalem, and they have strong drink, is what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Right? So you can imagine this woman who's she's been out having her strong drink, and she's trying to find her tent in the middle of the night and stumbles into the wrong tent and does something she shouldn't have. And, so it kind of actually does flow with the story. And even if it is a later edition, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it was a story that was passed down orally, and then later on someone was going, oh, we should add this in, and so they chose that place to add it in because it makes sense kind of with the flow.
That's right. And I kind of circling back to what you said earlier, but you just said because it was told orally. One of the first things that I came across, and I remember it was in... Now I remember. Now I can't remember the book. I was going to say John Walton, but it wasn't one of Walton's books. It was another book that was talking about ancient Near Eastern texts and their correlation to the biblical text, and how we can see how Israel lived within a culture. Mm-hmm. The opening chapter was one I'll never forget. It was really good. I say I'll never forget. I won't forget the chapter, but obviously I forget the book. But the chapter expressed so much about how oral transmission of ideas and truths and all this was so important, and it highlighted the fact, if you go back and you study the text, the most ancient text we have, and I always try to point this out, the most ancient texts we have, what were they? They weren't great philosophical ideas. They weren't great religious texts. They weren't these love letters. They were the most boring texts that you can come across. They were contracts of sales and deeds and contracts between kings. Why? Because the most important things were still passed down orally. They only started writing these things down because they needed proof, because people started ripping people off in contractual deeds. Mm-hmm. And so that's what started the writing process, or the importance for writing things down. But outside of that, oral transmission of truths and expressions of literature, it wasn't literature, it was all oral transmission. So we have to keep that in context,
Yeah, and I was going to say with that, people trusted orally passed down stories much more than they trusted written documents, because
exactly.
Again, most people couldn't read back then, and again, there weren't that many copies of it anyways, and so basically, if someone is just reading to you, they don't have that same level of trust in this person reading this document, because who's to say that this person isn't reading the document wrong or making up their own stuff while they're reading it? Whereas if a trusted elder in the community is retelling the story that he's been, told over and over since birth, there's a lot more trust in the validity of that story or that document, or whatever it is. And to go back to your point that you made, none of this, all of this critical scholarship, and by the way, the word critical is not a negative term. It just means critical scholarship.
Yeah, we should have said that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just remembered to put that in. Critical scholarship just means that you're trying to study deeper into the text and trying to figure out stuff beyond the surface level, I guess would be the easiest way to say that.
Yeah, you're looking at it critically, like critical thinking. You're not just blowing through it. You're looking at it critically, saying, where did this text come from? Who wrote it? How did they write it? When did they write it? That type of thing.
Yeah. And so if critical scholarship that looks deeper, beyond the surface level, comes to a different conclusion on when it was written or how it was written down, that doesn't take away anything at all from the inspiration of the text, and that it is God's word to us. It's just trying to get a better grasp on what do we do with the text, and how do we handle it, and how do we better understand it.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to shift subjects, so go ahead.
Oh, I kind of was too. I was going to shift back to our original discussion of documentary hypothesis and the JDEP. Do you want to go there, or did you have something else?
No, that's good.
I wanted to bring up, I studied, like I said, I had a class for this in a master's degree, and it was a straightforward class. These are the different criticisms, our methods of criticism, methods of studying the text, and we went through the entire Old Testament book by book every week, looking at objections to the text, what do critics say about it, and how can we address those things. It was very beneficial. Mm-hmm. Now, coming into this class, and the PhD is less instruction, and it's more what we call on the military instructor side, now they have a new way of instruction called facilitation. Mm-hmm. It's more facilitation of a discussion, but in this class, the professor got a new textbook for this semester that he'd never read, so he's reading it with us. But it's called A Brief History of Old Testament Criticism, from Benedict Spinoza to Brevard Childs, or Brevard, I think is Brevard Childs. But it's Mark Gignilliat. It's Gignilliat, Mark Gignilliat. And he has a very interesting approach, and I want to bring this up because you said you thought that some people had different motivations, and I do believe with this type of criticism there was definitely a motivation. And the way he writes this book is not like any other criticism overview that I've read. And I've read, almost a dozen different books on Old Testament criticism. He explores the different methods of Old Testament criticism by exploring almost the biographies of each person that is known for it. So Benedict Spinoza or Baruch Spinoza, he had an effect in the 1700s, and it explores his life. And you look at De Wet in the 1800s, and the way he viewed it. And then you get to Julius Wellhausen, and it explores his life. And his father was a pastor. I think they called it confessional Lutherans. His father was a very strict pastor. They lived in in an agrarian lifestyle out on the farm, and he did not get along with his father at all. When later in life, someone said, "How do you feel about?" And I'm paraphrasing here. They basically asked him, "How do you feel about the fact that you were totally espoused from your family and that you had no good relationship with your father?" And he said, "I'm only sad about it for my mother." Like he had no concern for his father at all. And when we look at the background to it, to his life, he didn't want to go to school for religion at all. He was almost a-religious. He only went to school because it was in the middle of the Enlightenment period where they were taking a scientific approach to the Bible.
Yeah.
Not as in what we run into today with the Bible as a science textbook, but they were picking apart the biblical text in almost this way that we're talking about. So he went to school for that, and he became very well known for languages and stuff. But it wasn't until later in school he came across, like I said, the idea that, the Torah was written after the prophets. And he jumped on the idea, and I was trying to find the quote. I didn't find it, because if you hear him say the quote, he basically says, "I didn't even need proof that this was true for me to totally take hold of it." He had no desire to even fact check it. It fit his mold of what he wanted to do. And what did he want to do? Because if you look at his life, he wanted to erase the priestly text. Why does he say the Torah was written after the prophets? Because he says that Israel's history was, they came about like every other religion, and they were free worshipers. They worshiped on every hill, and they could worship God however they wanted to. Later on, these bad Jews came about and placed all these ritualistic, centralized worship on them. They had to come to a centralized place. So what was he trying to get away from? He wanted to get away from the idea of organized worship, the thing that he wanted to get away from as a child.
Yeah.
And so that motivated him. And he was, to give him credit, he was kind of open about that, honest about that. Later on in his life, they would give him a professorship, I can't remember the title, where he was over the theological school, basically what we would call today the dean or the chair of the theological school. And he said, "My conscience weighs on me too heavy. I cannot teach these people to go out and be preachers because what I believe is contrary to that." And he resigned his position and went on to be a professor of languages.
Yeah.
So he was open about it, but it's still motivated. And a lot of people that are looking at this theory today, they ignore that motivation. They ignore that motivation that caused such a blind indiscretion when looking at the text in that way. So we always like to try to see where are people coming from. What motivates Ryan White to teach the way he teaches and to say the things he does. And those things are very important to me. One, because in my past, I can tell you, my wife will tell you, I'm the most misunderstood person that she knows.
Yeah.
People misunderstand me by and far. And so, one, that's why I try to look at others and say, why do they say these things? Why do they believe these things? And it usually highlights, what they're saying more.
No, I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. Is, I would maybe summarize that by saying, are these people taking the biblical text seriously? Maybe they're not coming to the same conclusion that we are, but are they actually truly seeking truth and truly seeking, to better understand what God wants for us in life, or are they just coming from a place of hurt, like you're talking about Wellhausen, who's really just trying to get back at his father?
That's exactly right.
And I have noticed, some of these, there's been some fantastic books I've read on Leviticus, but some of the stuff I just take with a grain of salt because, they use this documentary hypothesis in order to basically strip away the stuff in the ritual text in Leviticus that they don't want to deal with.
Absolutely.
And it's just
That's exactly
like,
what's going on.
It doesn't take the text seriously because, again, even if they're correct, and I'm really don't really lean towards that. I do, again, I'm more ascribed to there was probably commentators at some point in time who added stuff or updated the language, updated locations to present day locations versus old cities that no one knew where they were and stuff like that. But even if this whole documentary hypothesis is correct, ultimately God would have been there dealing with the text, and whoever's redacting it or putting these together isn't doing it in a haphazard way. They're putting it together because they want it together.
That's right.
If that makes sense. It was intentionally put there. It's like
to express the message.
Exactly. You look at Genesis, the creation account in Genesis 1 versus the creation account in Genesis 2. A lot of scholars are going to say, well, those were written by two different authors. Well, maybe, but the very fact that someone decided, let's assume that they were. Again, I don't necessarily think that's correct, but let's just assume that Genesis 1 was written by one author and Genesis 2 was written by another author. Well, then the divine inspiration is looking at those and saying, why did God divinely choose to inspire someone to put those two accounts side by side? What are they telling,
Exactly.
rather than just trying to minimize the text? And for that example, I would say Genesis 1 has a completely different perspective on creation than Genesis 2. Genesis 1 is kind of that wide-angle creation account lens, whereas Genesis 2 is an up-close and personal creation between God and man, whereas Genesis 1 is creation between God and all of creation, not just man.
That's right. I kind of brought this up in class Monday night on this very topic. We were kind of all discussing, and I go to a very conservative school where this was the one thing I was concerned about going into school, was having to fight against documentary hypothesis, and I ended up, through divine providence, because I never even researched the school before I attended there, I ended up at a school whose aim is to almost, they're very honest in the classroom, but you can tell all the professors are very much against this hypothesis. But
nice.
In the classroom discussion the other day, I brought the fact that, to me, we were kind of discussing where we stand on this, this criticism and other criticisms. And the one main thing for each of us, we're kind of going around the room. I say room, it was online. But anyway, we were kind of going around the circle there about what was the main thing that stood out to us. And for me, with documentary hypothesis, when you look at the text in this manner, it ignores the fact that the Bible is a piece of literature, that it's a beautiful work of art that is intended to express a message to us.
Yeah.
So why, looking at the very basis of DH, documentary hypothesis, looking at the very basis of DH that says, why does the author express Yod He Vav He as the name and then Elohim as the name? They never consider that maybe the author is trying to express a different character of God.
Yeah.
Why did, like you said, Genesis 1 and 2, why are they different? They never even consider the fact that maybe the author was trying to express a different perspective and give us a different view of creation. And to me, that was the number one thing that stands out.
Yeah, and I am 100% on board with you there. I think that, especially in those cases with a name, that each name has a different aspect, and so that's why you see the usage of one name here and another name there. And you see that throughout. And this is actually one of the reasons why I really liked this book, the Poetics book, Poetics and Interpretation of Biblical Narrative, because she points out, for example, and this is just another example to go with this, not mentioning the name of God, but the naming of characters in a story. You see that in the story of Bathsheba, right, with David, where he sleeps with her, where he seduces her.
Yeah.
She's not, like, it never tells us her feelings or anything like that. And this author points out she's not a fully fledged character from a literary perspective. That doesn't mean she's not a real person. It just means that the person who's writing this really doesn't want us to focus in on whether or not Bathsheba accepted or anything about her, because the story's all about David. It's not really about
Yep.
Bathsheba. Whereas later on, there's a story where David is old and he's dying, and actually the focus there is on Bathsheba and not on David, and so he becomes kind of one of these, just, he's just a character there, whereas the real focus is on other characters. So yeah, it kind of makes the Bible boring if we're just gonna to piecemeal it into these different authors and just say there's no reason. Someone just, as you said, just cut up it like it was a newspaper and glued little sections together. No one would think that the Bible was inspired if they did that.
That's right.
So
that's right. I was trying to find a quote here, but I can't find it. It was along those lines. But another aspect of it that really stood out to me was, if we think about it in this way, because they would suggest that over time all these things were written down and just scraps of paper were all kind of thrown together. But that kind of takes away from, and here I am running off and forgetting what my point was again. I'm sorry. I've got so many thoughts running through my head because we're limited time and there's so much to discuss here. But
yeah,
and now I've totally forgotten where I was going with it. I'm sorry.
Well,
I'll come back around to it.
I would say that idea not only takes away from any divine inspiration, but it makes the people who wrote it and the people who preserved it out to be stupid people, because
Oh, that's exactly where I was going. Suggests that the people had no idea or had no. That was what I was saying. It's along the lines of it being a work of literature. It suggests that people in that day had not, quote unquote, evolved enough to express literature in the way that we do today. It suggests that there's no way these people would have written something in this manner that later on, thousands of years later, someone else had to come back and try to piecemeal it together to make it make sense and to be readable and to flow in a beautiful way. So,
yeah, it's a sad idea, but as with anything, and I tell people this from time to time, I don't read books that I agree with, and same thing with theories. So for those people who are out there wanting to study deeper things, it's not a bad thing to look at this documentary hypothesis. Just realizing where these people are coming from, and realizing that it may help you kind of understand some things a little bit better, like those verses in Deuteronomy that I was talking about. But ultimately, we have to end up rejecting the documentary hypothesis theory and saying, there is evidence that there is later there's language that was added in later, or however that came to be, as we discussed earlier. But I think that I would not go out there and say that documentary hypothesis is a sound theory by any means.
No, and that kind of brings me to where I guess maybe we'll wrap up. This topic really is kind of close to me. I've personally seen, and this is a very specific topic that a lot of people maybe don't come across, but I've personally seen people leave the faith altogether, walk away from God altogether when faced with this hypothesis. And I mentioned just very recently, I was speaking to some people that you and I both have met, and was speaking on this topic, and they said, well, this theory is sound, and the idea that they were trying to express, and I found it interesting. I think that they were getting their idea from the same place that my old friends did, but the idea they were expressing was that God never condoned sacrifice. And if you follow Wellhausen, that was his point, was that God never condoned unified worship of God, that people were free to just worship however they want to. And I said, that's interesting, because I actually study a lot in this, not trying to be conceited or anything, but I was just expressing, I study a lot in this genre of study here, and the documentary hypothesis is really dying down. I mean, 100 years ago, you would not get anything published if you didn't accept the documentary hypothesis. Yeah. And that's not the case anymore. There's tons of authors out there that do it, and they said, well, I don't think that's true. Well, okay, we can argue about that all day, but I wanted to bring up a quote, is where I'm getting to. Gleason Archer. Gleason Archer is a very good scholar. He wrote a book, which was my textbook in the master's level, called A Survey of Old Testament Introduction. He's also one of the people that put together the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, which is one of my favorite resources.
Mm-hmm.
It expresses, it defines words in very long, expressive ways to really give you a good picture of what these Hebrew words mean. But he said, in other words, wherever this theory ran into trouble with the facts, because it runs into places where it's going to box itself in, or it ran counter to the actual data of the text itself, where this hypothesis should say this, but it doesn't, or it should read this way or it doesn't. He says the bungling hand of the R, which is the redactor, was brought in to save the situation. So, anytime a documentary hypothesis comes across a place where it's like, oh, well, this doesn't fit what I'm trying to present, they would say, oh, well, this redactor, these people that cut apart these texts, they just cut apart the text wrong here, and it really, it really doesn't make any sense. And he goes on to say, therefore, we must treat documentary theory as still a live issue today, because it is, even though liberal scholarship on the European continent has administered well-nigh fatal blows to nearly all of its foundations. Bellhausen School started with the pure assumption, they don't like to talk about that, but the pure assumption that Israel's religion was merely human origin like any other, and that it was to be explained as a mere product of evolution. It made no difference to them that no other religion known, apart from Hebrew offshoots like Christianity, or even, you could even say Islam, has ever eventuated to genuine monotheism. So and he says the Israelites too must have begun with animism and crude polytheism, just like all of the ancient cultures. So what Wellhausen says is that they were polytheists and they evolved into monotheists. Well, if that's the case, why has no other polytheistic religion in the world ever evolved into monotheism?
Yeah.
And that's a huge, huge fact right there.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And I just use that to highlight that no matter if you face these different critical theories, and maybe something, causes you to stumble. And I would say, Ryan, you and I have both talked together many times about, it's okay to have doubts at times. I mean, people in the Bible had doubts, and people in the Bible questioned God. It's okay to question God, but always acknowledging and remembering that your first love is God, and that this word was given to us by God. No matter how it was put together, who put it together, God has his hand in it. If you say that a bunch of people chopped and cut up all these pieces and put it together, and you ignore the fact that even God could have his hand in that, then, it's not documentary hypothesis that's leading you astray. It's your lack of faith in God. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I tell people from time to time, my faith in God doesn't come from the Bible. My faith in God comes from seeing what the people of God have done throughout history. That how faith in God, how people in both Jewish and Christian faiths have positively impacted the world over the past 2,000 plus years is amazing. And there's no question in my mind that God has been directing things. And sure, people go astray here and there. But ultimately, there is a God out there, and he does love us, and he is trying to reach us. And again, like you said, even if it's not Moses himself who wrote these things, which again, the Bible actually doesn't say that Moses wrote these things. That's kind of a tradition that's been passed down. But even if he didn't, and again, who knows? It doesn't mean that God's hand wasn't in the mix of whoever's doing this, and even whoever's translating things. The Septuagint translation. Who's to say God wasn't there with the Septuagint translators? It takes a kind of low view of God to think that that the Bible is not reliable, that we can't trust our Bible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you mind if I finish? I know
Yeah.
we wanted to be right about an hour. Do you mind if I wrap up? I want to wrap up in a way, or not in a way, but really just kind of giving some scholars and stuff. Something that I like to do is, you don't have to listen to us on these topics or just trust that we're going to research and give you the answers. I love to give people tools to study with as well.
Absolutely.
And so I already mentioned a couple scholars, Gleason Archer. Gleason Archer is very good. His critical introduction is very good. There's another scholar named Michael Coogan, Coogan.
Mm-hmm.
His approach to critical introduction is really good. Richard Hess, and he's one of my favorite. Richard Hess, H-E-S-S. You can get his book. It's called The Old Testament: A Historical, Theological, and Critical Introduction. And it's a very thick book. I forgot how many pages, almost 1,000 pages on the Old Testament. And he goes book by book. And I like him because he has a high view of Scripture. No matter how he's going to critically look at these books, he always keeps God in focus, that God is the ultimate author of the text. Mm. Richard Hess was one. I think that about wraps it up. There's some others out there, but that gives people some places to go and kind of start if they want to explore this topic from someone who holds a high view of Scripture. I do read things. I mean, I wouldn't know the things that I know about Wellhausen if I didn't read some of his works.
Yeah.
But I do always like to balance that with people who, as I like to phrase it, have a high view of Scripture, that acknowledge that God is the author and doesn't just look at it as a textbook to be, picked apart. So.
Well, yeah, and if anyone's seriously seeking and seriously struggling with this, don't just read commentaries that are pro documentary hypothesis. Read the ones that tear the theory apart too.
That's right.
That's something that they teach you in college is, maybe you have this view, but my professor would assign me books that go against this view. Right? With my thesis, when I first turned it in, my professor hands it back to me and says, you need to read some books that are against the idea of honor and shame culture. You need to include a discussion.
Not just to support your idea.
Yeah. So, really, really encourage anyone who's struggling with this, check out the books that Matt mentioned here that are showing you the flaws in it, and try to balance things out, because otherwise you're going to end up, as you mentioned, a lot of people, they start off rejecting Yeshua, rejecting the New Testament, or rejecting Paul or whatever, and ultimately they end up rejecting all of Scripture and becoming miserable people. From the ones that I've met, that they're not very happy. So, all right.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for being on here with us. Really quick, for those of you...
I enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to get on the Podbean website or the Podbean app and, give us some feedback on the show, and, subscribe to the channel. And also, if you're listening in on YouTube, or not YouTube, but iTunes. I guess you could like it on YouTube too, because we're on there as well. But if you're on iTunes, please consider giving us a review. Those positive reviews help this show kind of gain audience, gain popularity in the rankings, so that more people can discover the show and engage in these conversations with the Bible. So I hope that you all enjoyed the show this time. I know, again, there's a lot of stuff that we kind of discussed that was difficult, and honestly, a lot of the stuff that you probably won't ever deal with, hopefully. But for the few of you out there who have been dealing with and have been struggling with this, or those of you who are studying scholarly research and seeing this issue pop up, I hope that this kind of gave you a grasp on what's going on, and how this is not actually a theory that is required to understand and absolutely is true. This is just a theory out there that, as we've shown, really doesn't hold a whole lot of merit, even though there are some points in there that do kind of help us to understand things. So I hope you enjoyed the show, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Shalom.
Shalom.